Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. If you remember, the last day we met, we were talking about the second principle, competency. And so we're going to start back up on that on slide 9. So if you're following along with your slides, it's slide 9 of the competency. And I just wanted to mention again that professional code of ethical conduct for prevention specialists, the one that we emailed you that we need to sign as a certified prevention specialist. Right before we ended the other day, we were talking about that personal conduct and professional competency and how we have to be aware of our own personal well-being, and ethically, if we are struggling with substances or mental health, how we need to do something about that. And it is in our code of ethics, and I was just going to read that quickly. It says, prevention specialists shall have a responsibility to model and promote a healthy lifestyle and well-being by low risk or no use of alcohol, tobacco, and or other mood-altering chemicals. That one in particular, over the years, we've had a lot of debates about that. As a prevention specialist, what are your guidelines as far as use? And I kind of always go back to when we talked about this, when we were redoing this, we talked about how there can be, as long as you don't have family history or have addiction, there are low risk guidelines for alcohol. But when we're talking about like tobacco or other drugs, as a prevention specialist, I think it'd be hard to say you're a smoker and you're providing services to youth, because there's like no low risk when it comes to illicit drugs and tobacco. But that's a kind of an ongoing conversation when it comes around that. But I think the thing about it is that we just have to remember that we are role models for the youth that we're working with. So we need to not just talk the talk, but walk the walk. So we're conducting ourselves in an appropriate manner when we're out in public. In addition, prevention specialists have the responsibility to maintain sound mental health to prevent the impairment of professional judgment and performances. And so then it just goes on to talk about what we talked about last time about, recognizing when we're struggling with that, and then seeking out the professional services that we may need or self-help strategies we may need to help us through that period of time. Any questions about that? All right, so now where we left off, we talked about our personal, but now we're going to talk about addressing the unethical conduct of colleagues. So go ahead, Dodie, you can hit the next, there you go. So prevention professionals must report the unethical conduct of colleagues to funding, regulatory, or other appropriate bodies. And this can be even more challenging to notice and take action when we're observing unethical behaviors in others. So it's one thing to notice it in ourselves, but sometimes maybe we recognize it in colleagues, but it's hard for us to then address it. So part of being a competent prevention professional is taking action when colleagues have behaved unethically. And so we're going to look at, sometimes that's hard. And so Dodie, if you look at the next slide here, we might be feeling something like this, right? I'm not sure this is my responsibility. Shouldn't I just stay out of it? So maybe we do see something with a colleague, but I just kind of feel like it's none of my business, okay? The next one, I like this person. Will I damage our relationship? The next one would be, if I speak up, will I develop a bad reputation at work? And then that last one is, I don't want to get in trouble. Could my actions put my own job at risk? So while these concerns are understandable, I can understand that maybe we've had one or all of these feelings if we've seen a colleague performing unethical. But prevention professionals have an ethical obligation to address the unethical conduct or practices of colleagues. So when do we know what we should do or how we should handle this? Well, first of all, you would ask, does your agency have a policy? So yes, if they do, we're going to follow that protocol. And I know people don't love policy, but over and over again, it's so important that we have policies, practices, and procedures in place, because that protocol helps us decide. We don't have to guess. That protocol's in place. We know if this happens, this is the chain of where I go from there. So for me, it'd be my direct supervisor. From there, it would be the CEO. We also have a whistleblower, so we have a number we can call into. you know, whenever we're doing like a youth mental health first aid or mental health first aid, people will ask, well, what about this? What about that? And we're oftentimes saying, we'll go back to the policy that you have at your school or your agency. So that's going to really be that guiding principle for you. Some agencies possibly don't have policies. So these policies are to establish to support employees and ensure consistent responsibility. But if you don't have a policy, you're going to use your best judgment. So you're going to talk to your colleague. You know, first of all, you'd want to address it with that colleague, particularly if the behavior seems unintentional or relatively benign. So you maybe recognize something, but they might not even realize it was an unethical behavior. Maybe they showed a slide in a training, but they didn't note where the data came from. So they didn't note the source. So it was pretty innocent. So you just address it with them and say, hey, I noticed you had that data on there. We need to make sure we're putting where we get that from so that it's not a copyright issue. Sharing your concerns might be all it takes to end the unethical behavior and prevent such practices in the future. If that doesn't work, then you're going to talk to your supervisor about your concern and ask for guidance in handling that situation. If the behavior seems quite serious, so illegal or harmful, or your colleague or supervisor is not receptive to this discussion, then report the behavior to the most appropriate advisory or regulatory bodies. So if you have a board of directors or an agency director or funders. And then consider helping it to establish a policy or agency to support employees who confront unethical conduct in the workplace. So do you guys know, anybody, do you currently have policies in place at your agency when it comes to ethics? Diane says yes. Anybody else? You can just unmute it, or I see Charlie. I can't say everyone. I see Charlie saying yes. If you don't know, I just encourage you to go back to see what, you know, we have we have tons of policies at our agency. We have a policy book. So go back and look through it. And again, if you don't have one, maybe encourage you talking to your agency director, your supervisor about looking into creating one. So that, you know, again, it kind of takes that guessing out. You just kind of have that protocol and how to handle that situation. All right. Go ahead, Dodie. So we've finished exploring the expectations of the competency principles. So it was assessing your qualifications. So making sure that you're qualified to provide the services that you're providing. Do I have the credentials? Do I have the training that I need for it? Building your knowledge and skills. So if you recognize that you don't, you know, your agency or your supervisor asking you to provide a curriculum to students that you know nothing about. Okay, I need to go through this training. I need to have some more knowledge and skills to be able to provide this training. So if we don't have the qualifications, making sure we're building it before we provide those services. And also with that, knowing this is out of my scope of work and I need to refer this on if I really am not the best person to do this. We're going to use best prevention practices. We're going to use those evidence-based programs, policies, and procedures. We're going to make sure that we address our own personal impairment. So if we ourselves are struggling with substance use or mental health, we're going to make sure that we might need to take some time off, FMLA or vacation, get some professional help, but we're making sure that we are taking good care of ourselves so that we can help the people that we're working with. And then we're going to address the unethical conduct of the colleagues that we work with as well. Go ahead, Dodie. Does anybody have any questions about the competency principle, anything that we talked about last time or real briefly here this morning? So I would ask, again, you know, you have that prevention think tank of code of ethics pulled out, and then that should have been in the front part of your binder. So any of you that maybe weren't on the call the other day, you should have this prevention think tank of code of ethics. And then right behind that, you have ethics and prevention action steps. So number 2, you can see competency. There again, we want you to just write down, what did you learn or relearn when it comes to the principle of competency? And then write, one action do you plan to take based on this principle?
And just note that those that are taking it for USF credit, I will ask that you turn this in after our ethics is over, so.
Anybody willing to share what you learned or relearned or an action step you plan to take based on this principle? Nobody wants to share anything this morning?
I was finishing writing. I just wrote here, making sure you work in your scope, no matter what field you're in, is important. And my action step, I said, I will continue to address ethical issues if I see them personally and or professionally.
Great, thank you. Anybody else? That was great, Megan. We'll actually even talk about that a little bit more about, you know, you might be an addiction counselor, you might be a licensed professional counselor, but if your job as a prevention specialist, you need to kind of know what your guidelines are in there, even if you're credentialed and other things. So that was a great point. Okay, if no one else would like to share, we will just go ahead and move forward here. And then we're going to talk now about principle 3, integrity. Go ahead, Dodie. So do you know who these people are? Would anybody be able to name any of these folks up here?
Mother Teresa, Gandhi. I'm not sure who is that the gal, I can't remember her name, but was
Malala.
Yeah.
What?
Malala.
Oh, you guys are so smart.
Rosa Parks.
Yes. Don't ask, Dodie and I were laughing because it's like, don't ask us to say Malala's last name. But yeah, she's a Palestinian who won the Nobel Peace Prize at age 17. So would you say these people are people of integrity? The people you see up there, I see some head nods. I mean, of course, we're all going to maybe have some different opinions on that, but I think by and far you could, you know, if we think back to the lives that they lived, they definitely lived a life of integrity. Now I want you to think of someone from your own life who is a person of integrity. Once you have someone in mind, write down 1 or 2 words to describe that person. And then I'd ask if we could kind of go around, as many that would be willing to share, not necessarily the person's name, but just what was the relationship of that person to you that you wrote down? So was it your best friend, your brother, your mom, whoever it might be? And what were the words that you used to describe them?
Honest.
Honest.
Trustworthy and reliable.
Trustworthy and reliable.
Do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
Non-judgmental.
Yeah.
Honest.
Consistent.
Okay. Rebecca says consistent and transparent. What were some of the relationships? Again, you don't have to say their name, but who did you write down as a person integrity?
My oldest sister.
Okay.
I did too, Charlie. So not your oldest sister, my oldest sister.
Yeah. I thought maybe you guys had the same oldest sister or something. Mine would have been my brother. My dad, pastor, is what Holly said. Emily said a friend.
A good friend.
A good friend. Great. All right, so now we've come up kind of with a collective description of what we think integrity might look like. So let's compare that to how that matches up with the integrity principle. Rebecca said a friend too. Thanks, guys. You guys have good friends. So let's pull out that think tank code of ethical conduct. We're going to flip it over to number 3, integrity. Again, we've done this with the first two. As we read through this, would just ask you to maybe make some notes of any keywords or concepts that stood out to you as we read through this, maybe underline it or highlight some things that stood out to you, and then ask if anybody would be willing to share kind of keywords or phrases that really stood out to you. Is there anybody that would be willing to read the third principle, integrity? And if not, I can too. Okay. To maintain and broaden public confidence, prevention professionals should perform all responsibilities with the highest sense of integrity. Personal gain and advantage should not sub-oriented services and the public trust. Integrity can accommodate the advertent error and the honest differences of opinion. It cannot accommodate deceit or subordination of principle. All information should be presented fairly and accurately. Prevention professionals should document and assign credit to all contributing sources used in public material or public statements. Prevention professionals should not misrepresent, either directly or by implication, professional qualifications or affiliations. Where there is evidence of impairment in a colleague or a service recipient, prevention professionals should be supportive, assistance, or treatment. Prevention professionals should not be associated directly or indirectly with any service, product, individual, or organization in any way that is misleading. What does that mean to you as you read through that? Kind of what did the integrity principle mean to you, or was there any words or phrases that kind of stood out to you as we read through that?
Sorry, go ahead, Charlie.
I was just gonna say at the very beginning when it talked about personal gain.
Yep.
The piece about integrity accommodating like essentially an accident, a misunderstanding type deal, but not deceit or coordination of like going against something intentionally, that is here.
Yep. Thank you. Anybody else? All right, go ahead, Dodie. So these are the key concepts of the integrity principle that we will be covering. So providing accurate information, giving credit for ideas, information, and materials, avoiding deceit, and then supporting impaired colleagues and service recipients. Go ahead, Dodie. So first is providing accurate information. Everything you produce and present must be accurate, truthful, and reliable. But this isn't always easy. That sounds like, well, yeah, of course we would do that. I mean, we're ethical people, right? But what if exaggerating data could increase the likelihood that your program would receive funding? What do you think about that one? Do you think sometimes people do that not to be unethical, but just feel like, I mean, you can kind of tweak data any way you want it sometimes. So do you think people do that not to be unethical, but just feel like, oh, if we show it in this way, you know, we might really be able to get the grant that we need or the funding that we need?
I think that's unethical. I think it's different if you are not doing it intentionally and like, or like, you're really excited for a project. You're like, this is going to be great. We're going to go in there and like really change the world. So if it's some type of just like living on a pink cloud, I think that's different than intentionally knowing that you're going in and kind of like beefing things up.
Yep.
I mean, you can be really excited and try to sell something to someone to get the funding or to get the backing. But I think if you intentionally, like if you know that you're not going to be able to provide what you say that you're going to provide, then that's where it draws the line. It's not just like, well, we thought it was going to be really great and then it turned out to not quite work out. But
right. Very good.
I remember I had somebody say to me once, well, you can pretty much have the data say anything that you want it to say. And I kind of, I don't know, I felt like that maybe questioned whether that person had integrity, quite honestly.
Yeah.
Right.
You know?
Well, and that's very true. I mean, you might say, okay, we've reached, 25% of the, kids in the school district. And one person's going to go, oh, 25%, that's like nothing. And the other person's going to go, oh my gosh, 25%, that's like so great. Like that's a lot of kids.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like you can go in it kind of in different, like have a different perspective on it, but so you're kind of making the numbers look how you want them to. But if you go in saying, I know it was 25%, but if we go in and say it was a quarter of the population got this information, or like, if you're outright lying, then
right.
Yeah, so according to the integrity principle, anything that you produce or present must contain accurate information, even if it could reduce the chances of the program being funded. And then this next one is, how about if a colleague showed you the perfect statistic for your presentation, but you didn't know the source? According to the integrity principle, you still need to check the accuracy of the data from a reliable source. And so, that's tempting, like, oh, this is a great statistic that people would love to see. But if we don't know how to be able to back that up with the appropriate documentation, then we should not show that statistic. So whenever we produce or present data or other types of information, we just need to make sure that we are truthful, that we're using reliable sources, and that we check the accuracy, particularly if we don't develop it ourselves. So giving credit or copyright laws, I think this one is pretty common, and I think a lot of people do it not trying to be unethical. I know I've been guilty of this. So the integrity principle also indicates that prevention practitioners appropriately credit all materials they use. In the age of information and the internet, it is more important than ever to be aware of the copyright laws that protect the creators of original work by establishing rules for how this work can be used and reproduced. Copyright laws protect the authors and creditors of original published or unpublished work by establishing rules for how this work can be used and reproduced. And I think of this so often, I mean, more and more because everything's on the internet. I even feel bad. I was just saying the other day, like, if you're like on Facebook and the Argus Leader comes up, and if you click on it like 3 times, you no longer can get it anymore because you're not subscribing to the newspaper via online. And I'm like, I really should subscribe, because more and more people aren't buying a newspaper because you can read the newspaper online, and it's so cheap to do it online. And I feel like, that's their livelihood and their, so it just makes me kind of really think we really have to think about not only copyright laws, but when people produce their professional information to go out on the internet, we really need to be respectful and understand that that's their livelihood as well. And These laws apply to ideas, information, and materials that are not your own or your agency's, even when you are using them for educational purposes. You can find links to more information about the process for securing permission to use copyright materials and resources and links. We see this quite often in the Resource Center where people want to check out materials and then they want to copy things out of the books or the manuals. And I mean, my stance is always you open it up and you can see buying. Sometimes they'll say these are reproducible materials, you know, and then you've got that permission, but oftentimes they say they're copyrighted. And so then that's where you got to be ethical and say, I either have to contact the developers to see if I can be making copies of this, or I just can't make copies of it. You know, I just have to take it for what it is. All right, we have a little poll we're going to do here with you. So, Dodie, if you could launch that.
What's it called? Do you remember?
What does this, do you ever, maybe? What does this have to do with you? Do you not have one? We'll just go through them without it then. No biggie. So do you ever include information, ideas, or data that are not your own or your agency's in anything you produce? So I would say everybody be honest here and just raise your hand.
Oh, I found it.
Okay. So go ahead and just say yes or no to these 3 questions. And then once you're done, we'll just kind of process those. Looks like we have everybody.
Oh, we do. Sure.
I could actually have done that. Isn't that interesting? That's the first time I've ever been able to do that. So as a co-facilitator, I could stop share and launch the results. Interesting. All right. Do you ever include information, ideas, or data that are not your own or your agency's in anything you produce? 100%. Do you ever include images such as charts, graphs, photos, artwork, or graphics that are not your own or your agency's in anything you produce? And we had 9 out of 10 say yes. And do you ever include the actual text or adopt materials from a source that is not your own or your agency's? And 3/4 of us said yes on that one. So we can see it's very common. This was an eye-opener for me when I went through this class for the first time. I know you're always supposed to document those things, but you kind of think, yeah, who's ever going to know I used this, you know, on a PowerPoint or whatever. And it was an eye-opener for me to think, you know, that's unethical. I need to be thinking about that. Now, I would say this is a work in progress because I feel like as I think back, I do so many presentations and PowerPoints and I feel like, am I always 100% with this even today? I don't know that I am, you know, and so it's a work in progress, but it's something to always be keeping in the back of our minds that we need to remember this. So obviously, it looks like all of us at one point in time have done at least one or all of these. And so it's just important to remember copyright laws apply in each of these situations. Anytime you use information, ideas, or data that are not your own or your agency's, you do need to put the text or information that you've copied in quotes to avoid plagiarism. We need to always credit the author and source. When needed, obtain permission from the original author, creator, or publisher. And again, you could refer to check to see if your agency has policies on this topic as well. Any questions or comments about that? All right. Close this. So integrity cannot accommodate deceit. If you would just, I answered those questions with the thought that I am teaching someone else's curriculum that I'm just gonna look real quick, that we have paid for. Is that the same? No, that would not be unethical, Holly. I hear what you're saying. So you're saying, well, I've purchased this curriculum and I'm teaching that curriculum. that would not be unethical in any way. It would only be if I am making a presentation myself, and then I would let's say I'm teaching life skills and I decide, or youth mental health for say, and I decided to take some of those slides and create my own presentation, and I get up and I present that, and I don't say that Boston Life Skills created this information, or I don't say that this comes from the National Council on Mental Health, so you need to be, or if I pull a statistic from the internet and I don't know the data, where that came from and the accuracy of it, I shouldn't be throwing that number out there. And I do this all the time. I know, for one example, when I'm doing mental health first aid, and Dominique, on a side note, might know more about this, but I always say, I heard one time, I don't know where this comes from exactly, but if you have depression or anxiety on one side of your family, you have a 40% chance of developing depression or anxiety. If you have it on both, you have an 80% chance. I probably really shouldn't say that, because I honestly say to them, I really don't know exactly where that data point comes from. I've just heard it, right? So I really should have concrete, know where that comes from, and have the data to back it up, because you don't want to be representing misinformation, if that makes sense. Great question. So deceit may be used to intentionally further one's own personal or professional interests. For example, falsifying one's personal qualifications. So I think sometimes people will go in, let's say I would go in and say, I'm a certified prevention specialist. I am, but let's say I'm not. And I did that just because I wanted to look like I had better, I had these credentials, even though I don't, okay? To meet the expectations or goals of an agency, task force, or community. So for example, exaggerating the scope of the coalition's work in order to garner support and or resources. So we go in front of the board and we exaggerate our accomplishments and things that we've accomplished as a coalition so that we look better for funders or for the board. Or for seemingly good intentions, such as to benefit a program or to help an individual. So for example, overstating data in a grant application to increase the chances of getting funded. Regardless of the intention, deception is unacceptable because it diminishes the trust of others, both in us as prevention professionals and in the field of prevention, and it undermines the integrity. Questions or comments about that? Okay, go ahead, Dodie. So where there's evidence of impairment in a colleague or a service recipient, prevention professionals should be supportive of assistance or treatment. So we talked about already about if we see impairment in ourselves that we need to seek out help in whatever form it might look like. We need to show that same support for colleagues that might be experiencing impairment as well. What are some ways to help impaired colleagues or service recipients if you notice this in them? What are some ways you can help them? So if you notice a colleague was, let's say you get into work next day and they just look exhausted and they just seem like they're very distracted. And so you sit down to have a conversation with them. What are some things you could do to them? Offer to help with their workload. Great, Emily.
Talk to them. Ask if there's anything that they feel like they need.
Exactly. I've noticed that you just seem so exhausted and you just are having a hard time concentrating. Is there something you want to talk about? Is there something you need? A simple check-in, Rebecca says. Yep. Ask how they are and show concern without judgment. Absolutely. And that without judgment can be tough sometimes. We can feel like, gosh, this person has not been pulling their weight around work. They come in late, they seem tired all the time. I'm having to pick up, things for them, do things that they should be doing. So it can, without knowing the backstory, sometimes we can come in with judgment, right? And so just coming in, showing concern without judgment can be huge. And then once you've had that conversation and you feel like they need some supports, hopefully most of us have, again, an EAP program. So an employee assistance program where we could refer them onto, where typically you get anywhere from 3 to 6 sessions for free. So that might be a good starting point for them. Talk to them and encourage them to seek out, I'm so appreciative you're willing to talk to me about this. Have you ever talked to, your doctor or a mental health professional about this? Is there somebody that, you would trust going to? Referring them to a counselor. I know a great counselor here in town. I've seen them before, whatever it is, would you like me to get you that contact information? And then accommodate efforts by the individual to seek help. So see a counselor, attend support groups, or even recovery meetings. Go ahead, Dodie. So when we're talking about that integrity principle, again, those key concepts is making sure that we're providing accurate information. So we don't just pull these statistics out of nowhere. We have the data behind it to support it. Giving credit for ideas, information, and materials. So anytime we're doing any sort of presentations, PowerPoints, we make sure we're crediting those where we got that information from. We want to avoid deceit, even though we might do it with good intentions. We can't go in and say that we have more training than what we do, or the credentials that we don't have, or that our coalition is doing all of these great things when they're not, just to make it look better than what it really is. And then supporting impaired colleagues and service recipients. So making sure that that's an ethical obligation. Not only is it a good thing to do as a kind coworker, right? Or as when we're working with those service recipients, but it's an ethical obligation that if we notice they're struggling maybe with addiction or mental health, that we, have that conversation with them non-judgmentally and get them to connect to the resources they may need in that situation. Go ahead, Doni. So again, I'd ask you to pull out that ethics and prevention action steps and turn to the principle 3, integrity. And do you have any questions about the integrity principle, anything that we talked about there?
When you talked about, like if you're doing a PowerPoint, you use someone else's idea or whatever. What about like pictures? Like, like you had these pictures on your PowerPoints, the hands raising and stuff like that. So I use a lot of pictures off the internet.
Well, and I would say if they're public domain, like I always think I go to, when I do a PowerPoint, you can put in, what does it say, like work art, and you can type in what you're looking for, and those pop up. That's public domain. I mean, some of those some of those images, like if they're, what do they say, like something stock on them, that you have to purchase. But I think a lot of those are public domain. Dodie's giving me this really weird look. So do you disagree?
Well, no, I think you're totally on. But, there's times when I'll like, gosh, I really want to, I'd like to have a picture of something like this or that. And so I'll go to Google and then I'll click on images. So if I'm going to use one of those images and it does come from a certain source, that's where you should probably make sure that you're citing that. Mm-hmm. But yeah, like if you're just going to your PowerPoint, you're clipping on that you want to add, what is it called? Like clip art or whatever it's called. And if you search that way, then I think that should be okay. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's something, I mean, that is definitely an area where I need to improve on because,
Right. Other thoughts or comments on that one? Good question, Belinda.
I kind of think it's about knowing like where you're getting that clip art. Is it something that is like free use, that kind of thing, versus a copyrighted something that is like am I making sense?
Yes.
I think that they teach in computer classes, I think like in our middle school and stuff, at least if those clip art images are in Publisher or whatever already, you've paid for those. That's not something that you need to worry about. But like Googling an image or whatever, if they have a watermark across them, those are the
Right.
ones you especially need to pay for or cite. But a lot of even the images that you Google are, unless they label them as where they're sourced, they're fine to use for images. Now, graphs and other information, that's a different
Right.
story.
Yep.
I think it depends on what the image is adding to the presentation. Like if you're implying some kind of like data, or that it is from I don't think I can really say what I'm trying to say, but you want to always present it like, even if it is just from publisher or something, you want to make sure that people aren't getting the impression that it is from like a validated research article or something like that. And so even though it is free, I still think it's important that it's presented for what it is.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so I feel like, excuse me, a picture of, all the people's hands in the middle of a, like a kind of a drawing, I'm just trying to think of some common ones I've seen on a PowerPoint, would be different than, again, like you're saying, a graph or something of information that, you'd want to make sure that it's, you wouldn't just want to throw up a graph and not have information to say where that came from, to not only make sure it was accurate information, but that we're sorting the person that went through the time and effort to get that. But yeah, I hear what you're saying, Charlie. It's a tough one. I feel like there's a little gray area when it comes to this one and the pictures and noting all that, but I definitely feel like when in doubt, probably always best to put where you've gotten that information if you can, noting where that comes from. And that simply can be just a little, in the right hand corner of the slide, just saying source and then saying where it came from. Good question.
So I have a question.
Okay, so if you again would write on that for integrity, what did you learn or relearn, right? One action do you plan to take based on this principle?
So the question I have is, how if you have an agency, like social media page, and if we share something like that we found on YouTube, or are there any issues with that? And the reason I even bring it up is because I'm also in charge of our church's Facebook page. And so this year when we were, stuck in COVID and weren't meeting face to face, I was talking to my pastor about, what do you think about if I share a song off YouTube or something like that? And he had real concerns with that because of copyright issues.
Well, if it's on YouTube, you're just resharing that.
That's what I was thinking too, but
yeah.
he was like, no, I don't think we should do that. So I didn't.
I think it depends on like what you're sharing it for. Like right now when we watch YouTube videos, I think it's okay, but like on podcasts or like whatever, if you share a song, anything that has music in it at all, or like a clip of something like a movie trailer or whatever, you can get in trouble for that because it's copyrighted. So I think the issue with it is that like for something like a podcast or whatever that's monetized, like then that's when it becomes an issue of like you're using it on your platform to make money,
right,
and then not giving money to whoever
right.
gave permissions to use it.
Right.
But so if it was like you and your friends just hanging out or sharing for whatever, your Bible study group or whatever, then I think it's okay. But if you're using it as a means of making money, then I think that's when it becomes an issue.
Which makes, again, I understand they have to make money, and so you don't want, but if it's on YouTube and they've posted it on there, anybody can go to that and view that, whereas if you somehow downloaded something where you can illegally get songs for free, and you didn't pay for them or something, obviously that's unethical. But if it's on YouTube, and as Emily said, great point, you're not doing it to try to garnish money from it.
And it doesn't garnish money from it because they get the money from the views. So when you show it, they're getting those views.
Okay.
So
great point. Thank you.
yeah.
Great.
So you're actually helping them by sharing it.
And that's just understanding the back side of that. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. Anything that you'd want to share of one action step you may plan to take based on this principle? Hearing none, I'm going to turn it over to Dodie and we will move on to principle 4.
Okay. So principle 4, the first 3 principles that we talked about were pretty, I think when you would hear them, you would kind of know what we were going to be talking about. But with nature of services, it's kind of vague. So before we explore this principle, we're going to try to shed a little bit of light on what this might mean. So above all, do no harm. This is a well-known statement from the medical ethics, and it captures really a lot of what the nature of services principle is all about. So let's think about this for a second here. We're supposed to go into a small group, but I think we'll just kind of chat about this as a large group here. So what do you think above all, do no harm means? What does that mean to you?
Means that no matter what decision you make or what action you take, you need to be cognizant of how it's going to affect others, and if it's going to hurt them, don't do it.
Great. Okay, thank you. And so thinking about that, what professions do you think this applies to?
I think it should apply to all of them.
Yep, I would agree. So when we're thinking specifically about prevention, how does it apply?
So I don't really know if you would consider this related to prevention, but I had a talk with a client who says that he's generous because he makes his money by like selling drugs, and then he gives it to his family and friends. And so he's generous. And I'm like, yes, but you're hurting people in the process of making that money. So you're also greedy. And so then we talked about legal versus illegal. And I'm like, well, tobacco companies make their money legally, but it's still the same concept. And so in regards to prevention, I feel like there needs to be more accountability and more advocacy, lobbying. I'm not sure on that side of the field.
Can I say something quick, Dodie?
Yeah.
Charlie, that makes me think of like when I do the Botman life skills training, kids can get into that legal, illegal, right versus wrong. And so they take the standpoint, well, is it healthy or unhealthy? Is it protecting the things that you value, or is it putting the things that you value at risk, basically? And I mean, yes, he could say, well, I think it's healthy because I'm providing money to my family that they need, but obviously it's very unhealthy because it's providing drugs to people that is, going to hurt them. But anyways, because I know kids can really get into that right versus wrong. Well, it's legal, it's, versus illegal. And so just kind of that healthy versus unhealthy.
I think that right versus wrong, or like do the right thing, there's no way to do that, there's no way to be right 100% of the time. And like in my field too, like if I was measuring my success by right versus wrong, like I wouldn't know, And so, yeah, I take the good versus bad or healthy versus unhealthy stance a lot because that provides a lot more opportunities for success.
So far what I've heard is advocating in the field we need to advocate for health, we need to advocate for safety, which might even go into lobbying, which a lot of times we can't do. And I think we talk about that here in a little bit, what advocacy is versus lobbying, basically. And so what are some other ways that you think that above all do no harm might apply to prevention? Is there any other thoughts or ideas?
Could you repeat the question that you just asked?
Yeah, so we're looking at, how does above all do no harm? How does that apply to prevention? We've heard that it applies in that we need to be looking out for the health and the safety of the people that we're working with, for our communities. That could be on an individual basis. It could be, trying to do some environmental things and advocating for changes in systems and things like that. Are there any other examples that you can come up with?
I think sometimes it's important, well, not sometimes, it's important to remember that like the population that we work with are still children, and we don't want to traumatize them. So we can have prevention and teach them why like drinking and driving is bad, maybe without having like majorly gory, bloody, car wreck scenes, or have like grotesque images of maybe needles or, physical harm and those kinds of things. I mean, we can have an open discussion without getting too deep into some of those details, especially depending on the age of the population that we're working with. Mm-hmm. So I think that could be really important. And then also, having it be based on education and growth and not shame and embarrassment. Because we do know that if we go into a classroom or, meet with a group of kids, some of the people that we're talking to are already going to be users or, experimenting with drugs and alcohol. So, just saying like, hey, this is why we want to educate you on this, and not like, if you've drank, you're a bad kid or you're a bad person or like you're destined for failure. And so I think that's really important because that can do more harm than good, by shaming them or traumatizing them into forcibly following what you want them to do.
Absolutely. All very good points. Not using those scare tactics. And even what you talk about, not wanting to shame them if they are already starting to use. But what about even if you're having a conversation about alcohol or smoking or marijuana? We have to be cognizant of the fact that we probably have youth in the room whose parents or maybe older siblings. And so you know that conversation can lead them to be thinking about, gosh, does that make my parents a bad person? Or, so we really have to be aware of that and how we're presenting that information as well. And it's interesting, those scare tactics that you talk about of showing that gore and things like that. I still run into parents, and especially when we were talking about meth, and they're like, we just need to show them those pictures of those people who have been on meth and the befores and the afters, and we need to scare them into the thinking, knowing that they shouldn't do that. I mean, to this day, I still come up with that's how they think prevention should work. And so it does take a lot of education, even at that level, to say, you know what, there are other evidence-based ways to influencing or educating our children that don't involve those scare tactics and don't involve that maybe showing them something that could be traumatic to them. So thank you. So what I'd like you to do is turn back to your I can't find it now. Ethics and prevention sheet, the think tank. Oh, it's because I have it setting to the side so I don't lose it. There we go. And if we could turn to the nature of services, it starts on the bottom of page 2 and goes on to page 3 there. And so I'm just going to read through this quickly, and I would like you to underline some of those key points that stand out to you again. Practices shall do no harm to service recipients. Services provided by prevention professionals shall be respectful and non-exploitive. Services should be provided in a way that preserves and supports the strengths and protective factors inherent in each culture and individual. Prevention professionals should use formal and informal structures to receive and incorporate input from service recipients in the development, implementation, and evaluation of prevention services. And then the last one is, where there is suspicion of abuse of children or vulnerable adults, prevention professionals shall report the evidence to the appropriate agency. So after reading through that, what are some of those key points that kind of stood out to you?
Services provided by prevention professionals shall be respectful and non-exploitive.
Thank you. Anything else?
Well, for me, after coming back into the field after a long time being gone, the mandatory reporting.
Mhm.
You know, I remember last fall I had the situation that I had to report, and like it happened, and the kid came to me, and I was like, oh yeah, like it was kind of a shock to me, like, oh yeah, I got to report that, you know. And I talked to my supervisor about it first, and she was like, oh yeah. So it was, you know, just living in it, you know, it was just a good reminder. So just reading that took me back to that time.
Yep. Thank you. Did anyone kind of catch where point B was going, where it really kind of focuses on involving our population that we're working with in the SWIFT process, right? So kind of ties back to the first part of SAPST that we went through. So the nature of services principle underscores the expectation that we as prevention professionals will always strive to act in the best interest of our service recipients, and above all, do no harm. So the principle prescribes two ways that we can do that to fulfill this expectation. The first one is to better understand and act in the best interest of the people that we serve. Prevention professionals must involve members of the focus population throughout the prevention process, just like I just pointed out with that point B there. And secondly, prevention professionals must act respectfully and responsibly toward the service recipients at all times. So in other words, the nature of services principle really guides us on how to approach the work of prevention and how we should conduct ourselves in the process. So we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at how do we involve that focus population, how can we make sure that we are protecting our participants from harm, and what do we need to do to maintain those appropriate boundaries. So first, let's look at involving the focus population. I love this phrase, nothing about us without us. I refer to it quite often, especially when I'm working with coalitions and thinking about, you know, we're working for youth basically, and how many of the coalitions actually have youth input on that particular coalition. I feel like this is maybe across the board one of those that we really need to kind of work on developing a little bit more. So this statement actually was made popular by the disabilities rights movement, and it really reflects the core value of the prevention practice and the core expectation of the nature of services principle. It really says that people should have a voice in the matters that affect their health and their communities. So what do you feel are the benefits of involving the focus population and other community members in prevention? What are going to be the benefits to involving them?
The people who are living it are the experts.
Absolutely.
So involving them is the only right thing to do. Like,
absolutely. How about when we're looking at, if you can vaguely remember the steps of the SWIFT process, how, what are going to be the benefits in our prevention process? So do you think they would be helpful in helping us to identify and prioritize the needs or what the issues that are happening? Yep, I see head nods. How about revealing and tapping into assets and the strengths? You know, we might not know everything that exists within that particular community. And so having them be able to help us to know well, what are the resources that are already available and things like that. Then also, you know, having them to help us build that capacity for prevention. They will know kind of where are those gaps and what needs to be addressed and who else needs to be involved and things like that. And then also looking at, you know, selecting appropriate programs and strategies. If they are involved in that process, they're going to be able to say, help us to know, do we think that this can work in our particular population, or is it going to be a struggle to make that particular program work? And is there any other programs that might be fit our needs better? They're also going to be able to help us to uncover or discover any potential obstacles that might come in our way. Like maybe they know that there's a certain individual who's going to try to, that might be a barrier for our prevention efforts. And they might know how can we still move forward and work around that potential barrier. And then also they're gonna, if they're more bought into the program, it's gonna help them to feel like, you know, they're part of it, and you're gonna be able to celebrate successes with them. So by working in partnership with our community members, we really demonstrate the respect for the people that we serve, and we increase our own capacity to be able to provide those prevention services and meet those genuine needs of that particular population. It's really going to help us to build on their strengths that they have, and it's going to help us to produce those positive outcomes. So the nature of services principle emphasizes the importance of involving community members throughout the prevention program, like we just talked about. And it really kind of goes back to even the cultural competence that we've been talking about throughout the SPIF process and things like that. So involving diverse community members in prevention is an important part of adhering to both the non-discrimination principle and the competence principle, as well as this nature of services principle as well. So when we're looking at community participation, you can see here on the slide it's got different levels, right? And so in your binder behind, there's a section of handouts. So we're in section 5, so right behind the PowerPoint slides there should be a handout that says promoting community participation. So I would like you to kind of look at that one as we're kind of going through this here. And so there are 4 levels of participation in the prevention process. The first one is to inform. And that means we're going to provide information to community members about prevention needs and strategies. So as you can see on your handout, this can be done through like brochures, tip sheets, posters, flyers, press releases, social media, maybe press conferences, public meetings, local events, things like that. So we're just basically sharing information with them. The second level is to consult, and that is where we're going to obtain input from community members about prevention needs and strategies. So by obtaining input, we're trying to find out information from them. And so we might do that through surveys, maybe focus groups, maybe some key informant interviews. We might hold some public meetings where we have some public discussion to get input there. Maybe it is that we might invite a community member to come and speak at maybe a meeting that we're holding, things like that. Or even just spending time where people gather and having conversations with them is a good way to get information from them. The next level is collaborate. And at this level, we're going to work with community members to make decisions about prevention needs and strategies. So we're going to invite them to, work with us on some key tasks. Maybe it is that we're going to design a survey. So for example, in Watertown, whenever we do the Pride survey, which is every other year, Pride lets you add an additional 10 questions to that survey. And so a lot of times we spend a lot of time discussing what are those questions that we want to add to that. At a time when maybe the school was seeing an increase in bullying rates, for example, they might want to add something about bullying behaviors to kind of assess, so is it as bad as what we think it might be, or things like that. Or maybe For example, you might be wanting to write a highway safety grant about seatbelt use, and so we need to assess that if that's not in the PRIDE survey. So things like that, getting input from the community members as to what they need on there as well. And then the last one is to empower. And for this one, it is to build the capacity of the community members to make their own decisions and lead the prevention efforts. And we can do this through, offering trainings and workshops on prevention planning, delivery, and evaluation, mentoring relationships, and then opportunities for community members to make decisions and take the lead. So again, in Watertown, we have another coalition called Glacial Lake Safe, which stands for Suicide Awareness for Everyone. And so, we don't have any suicide prevention funds that come from the state anymore to support this coalition. So this is pretty much community supported from here on out. And so they're still meeting on a monthly basis. Kelly is still, organizing that meeting. But really, there's different groups that are really taking a lead in moving forward with like trainings for this. So for example, Prairie Lakes Hospital has decided we need to really beef up our efforts in offering trainings such as, question, persuade, refer. And then how can we do that? How can we work with you? We have the funding for that, things like that. Or another example is we had a race car driver who got wind of the coalition, and they had a loved one that had passed away due to suicide. And so they started working with the coalition, and now they have the 1-800-273-TALK along with the Glacial Lake Safe logo on their race car. And so, and a lot of times any funds that they maybe receive, they will donate back to the coalition. So, it's kind of been a really neat thing to see people, even though there's no funding for that coalition, they're still motivated to move forward to help address the issue of suicide and mental health in the community. So the second key concept is, whoops, I didn't know that was there. The second key concept is to protect our participants. So according to the nature of services principle, we can protect them by, obtaining informed consent, specifically when we're looking at participation in research activities, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later. Conducting background checks on all staff and volunteers who will interact with our service recipients. And the last one is reporting any suspicion of abuse or neglect among our service participants to the proper authorities. So we're going to take a little bit closer look at each one of these. So prevention professionals, we really need to make sure that community members fully understand and are willingly agree to participate in prevention-related activities. So in other words, we need to obtain not just consent, but informed consent. And what does that mean? So to be considered informed consent, the process of obtaining consent from prevention participants must include these three elements that are listed on the slide here. So the first one is information. As prevention professionals, we really need to provide details that fully describe and explain the research activity, including its purpose, the procedures that will be used, and any anticipated risks or benefits. We need to let the people know that they can ask questions and/or they can withdraw from the research activity at any time. The next one is comprehension. So the information that we are giving to them about this research that we're doing, we need to make sure that we're presenting it in a way that is understandable to them, okay? And if that means involving third parties such as translators, or if we're working with youth, making sure that their parents are on board and they understand it, we just need to make sure that we are cognizant of that. And then the last one is voluntariness, which I didn't really think that that would be a word, but it is. We need to make sure that the people are providing their consent willingly, free from any coercion, which is a threat of harm. If I don't do this, harm's going to come my way, or undue influence, which is offers of excessive or inappropriate rewards. So when we're looking at consent, there are two different processes of gaining consent, and that is active and passive. So in both consent processes, we as professionals must provide appropriate information about the research activity. The difference between the two is that active consent requires signatures from all participants in the research activity and or their legal representatives. So an example of this would be how some people are interpreting the law that if you do a survey in the school, you have to have active consent. That means that you send out a letter that says, we're going to be doing the search survey, this is what it covers. If we need you to return this form signed form in order for your student to be able to participate. Okay, versus the passive consent, where I send this letter out that we're doing a search survey, for example, and if they do not return it that says that they don't want their student to participate, then that means they are giving the consent that their students can participate in this. Okay. So can you think of, or can you share an example of a time when you've had to use either one of these two forms of consent? Have you guys had to use this at all in your prevention programming? Okay, so maybe not at your level, but I'm guessing at like maybe more of the director level, things like this have happened. You know, I talked about the law that where it says more, some people are interpreting it as it has to be active consent. We've really seen some issues with that in regards to being able to gather the appropriate data, gathering enough responses to make it relevant to the population that we're serving. There are some schools though that have still maintained the passive consent, and I don't know, they found some kind of loophole in that, but most of them have gone to the active consent, and that has really kind of hurt some of our data points across the state in regards to our prevention efforts.
I wouldn't say it was so much loopholes as I feel like
interpretation.
At least Department of Health felt like schools were kind of misreading the law and taking it a different way. But I do know that that's greatly impacted Lifeways in Rapid City. I know Rapid City has taken that very seriously, as Sioux Falls has. And when you've got hundreds of students, you're trying to get active consent from parents, that makes it really difficult. So we're not able to collect the data as we were in the past when we had that passive consent where a parent just had to say something if they didn't want their student to do it. So it does make things more difficult for sure.
Mm-hmm. And I remember way back in the days when I was doing safe and drug-free school programming, where I'd have to go in and look at like their data and the programming that they were doing and things like that. There was one school in our area where I went to, and they did a survey consistently, but they had active consent, and the number of students that responded to it was just so low that I didn't feel like they were getting a good grasp of what was really going on within the student population there. So, all right. So,
Jody, there was a time way back when the schools put it in their student handbooks that when they signed, you know, at one time they were supposed to sign their student handbook at the beginning of the year, and it was put in there, if they signed in the student handbook, then they agreed that they were supposed to take this survey. That was all.
I really think that some schools maybe are handling it a little bit like that today, even where, you know, how when you go to school and you have to sign the release that you can have your picture in the media or anything like that. I think they've also added, some schools have added that piece to their signing at the beginning of the school year as well.
Oh,
so
really? They did away with that. Interesting.
Right. Any other thoughts or comments?
I was trying to think about Project Success this year. Michelle mentioned Lifeways, and I do remember Paula talking about how much that is going to affect our data collection. But see, I don't know what Lifeways did before, but I remember when I went to Stevens High School and was helping Matt do Project Success over there, he handed out these survey forms, and I don't remember if they brought them back, and I think there was an option, like if they brought the survey back, there was a box that said, my child can participate. I think there was another box that said my child can't participate. First of all, just getting them to bring the surveys back, was difficult. And then some of the parents did fill them out and say they couldn't participate.
Right.
But I don't remember how that was different. I don't know how that was different than years previous.
Well, this has been about 4 or 5 years of this now. But prior to that, you could just go ahead and give that survey to all the students. Parents would have to passively, they would have to call the school and say, I do not want my students to participate in this. You didn't have to give active consent from the parents saying my student can participate in this. It was just if they didn't want them to, they had to contact and say they didn't want it. And so you virtually got almost 100%, maybe a few parents calling in, but this way, yeah, that's part of it. Kids don't get it back. All of a sudden parents start second guessing this. Like they somehow think that we can get their students' information, even though it's completely confidential, anonymous, but they somehow think it's tied back that we're going to be able to nail down that, Jane over here was the one smoking marijuana, even though we don't have any ability to do that. And so it really becomes muddy.
Right.
I know we've gotten a lot of kind of resistance too from parents when we have them fill out ROIs that have DSS on there, because it just says like Department of Social Services for South Dakota, and they're like, no, because if if my kid comes to school and says that, or comes to group or treatment and says one thing, you're going to report us to DSS. And some people have been maybe kind of burned by that system, or they know somebody that has been, or they're just afraid to get kind of involved in that. And so we've had some people say like, so we have to be really kind of specific about like what that means to us, like as far as like the licensing board and like what communication we do have with Department of Social Services, because that's always a red flag for people. They're like, well, no.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of that came about too with that youth risk behavior survey that the state took.
Yes, because we missed a whole year of data point because they didn't have enough responses.
Right.
Mm-hmm. All right, so when we're looking at protecting research participants, let's see here. So informed consent is particularly important when the prevention activity involves research. And when we're talking about research, that means that we're collecting information from participants beyond basic demographics. So we might be asking about an individual's substance abuse behaviors or a mental health status, things like that. And if we're going to be using that information in some way, such as for evaluation or for publication or something like that. So consent to participate in research really differs from consent to release confidential information, which we will talk about when we're talking about the confidentiality principle. How many of you have ever heard about the Tuskegee study that was done? I see some head nods. Does anyone want to talk to it, or are you familiar enough where you can talk about it? I see some head shakes. Okay. All right. So the Tuskegee study was a 40-year study of untreated syphilis in African American men, and it was conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service. It began in 1932. So for this study, participants were misinformed about the purpose of the study. They were never given treatment for the disease. and they were never informed that they could leave the study at any time to pursue treatment. Even when they found in the 1940s that penicillin was an effective treatment for syphilis. So this led to 30 years later, so 1973, a lawsuit that really led to more rigorous requirements to protect the rights of participants in research. So this is why we're talking about this, is because, you know, they were not informed of what was going on. They were not given the option to opt out at any time to receive. So you can just see there were a lot of ethical behaviors that were not good for this particular study. So the next thing that we look at is, because of this Tuskegee study, they developed the IRB, which is Institutional Review Boards. And they were established to protect the rights and the well-being of human research subjects in the United States. You know, most large institutions like our universities in the state, they have their own IRBs that oversee research activities conducted on site and or by their members. And so I'm thinking about a couple years ago, we had this opportunity that coalitions could apply to do a needs assessment of opioids. And basically what it was they were just going around and they were asking questions from the different community sectors, kind of like what the perceptions were of opioids and things like that. And most of the coalitions were free to be able to do that. However, Northern State University wanted to be able to do that, but they had to wait for approval from their IRB in order to be able to do it. And by the time they finally got that approval, pretty much the funding had ended. So it is a process that does take place. And then the last thing that we look at is that if you are new to the world of research, and we know that there are many rules and regulations surrounding ethical practice, and this can be overwhelming. And so we have experts within the state that can help us through that. There's people at the state level who would be able to help us through that as well. They'll just help us to move forward in an appropriate and ethical way. There is a particular handout called Seeking IRB Approval that's found in your handouts just behind the PowerPoint section as well. You know, when we first got the SPIF-SIG, the state incentive grant, back in, gosh, 2010-ish, was that when it was, Michelle? I asked the question of our evaluator, you know, why did we not have to go through the IRB process at that time? And what he said to me was, you know, it was because we were offering this service to everyone, and we didn't have like a research group where this group's not going to get the service, this group's going to, and we're going to compare those results. So we didn't, because it wasn't research like that, we did not have to go through that particular process when we were doing that needs assessment. The next thing we look at is conducting background checks. So it's really important that we screen everybody, whether it's staff or volunteers. And we're doing this because we want to protect our participants, and we want to mitigate the risk of them causing harm to the participants that we are offering services to. So, you know, some people might feel uncomfortable initiating those background checks, but others might feel that they are unnecessary or maybe even inconvenient. And so these next few slides have a couple of concerns as to why this might be. So this one says, you know, I know this person really well. He will be offended if I ask him to do a background check. Okay. The next one is, you know, this person works for an agency that probably did a background check already. So an example of this is, you know, my husband works, he's a 4th grade teacher, and so had done the background check. Well, every year he has, when he coaches American Legion baseball, they require that the coaches have a background check, regardless of the position. You know, in a small community, I could see where somebody might say, oh, well, he's going to be offended if I have him do a background check. But if it's their policy, there's no offense needed, right? Because it's just the way it is, no matter if you know them or don't know them.
When I came to CSS from Child Protection Services, I couldn't work alone with clients until my abuse and neglect screening came back, and I had just come here from Child Protection Services.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. Thank you. Good example. And then the last one is a volunteer dropped out at the last minute. I'm not sure I have enough time to screen a replacement. You can see where, you know, that would be stressful, right? And if you thinking, gosh, I know this person, they just came from, you know, DSS, Child Protection Services, they should be fine. Well, if your policies and procedures say you just have to do it, right? In order to be ethical and even legal, we need to really conduct those background checks. And so there are, when we're looking at background checks, and to ensure that our reservations of, well, I know that person, or they just came from this field or whatever, so that those thoughts don't get the best of us, it's helpful to put in place the 3 keys of a thorough screening process. The first one is policy, making sure that we have a policy for conducting background checks on all staff and volunteers. We need to make sure we have protocol for how our agency will conduct those background checks. And then lastly, a plan for how we're going to manage and make use of those results. So like Catholic Social Services, obviously you have a policy and procedure in place for background checks. For those of you working with other organizations, I would encourage you to find out, do you have a policy and procedure? You know, if you are recruiting volunteers for a certain activity or event that you're having, what is your policy and procedure? So that would be kind of a little piece of homework if you don't already know, to go back and kind of do some research. What is your organization's policies and procedures surrounding the background checks for staff and for volunteers? And then the last piece that we're going to take a look at is reporting abuse and neglect. So we must take action if we become aware of abuse and neglect among those involved in our prevention efforts. It's not really only a core expectation of this principle, but it's also state and federal law that requires human service providers to report to proper authorities the evidence of any abuse or child neglect, or for children and or vulnerable adults. So I did happen to go and print off, you know, who do we report that to? You would, I'm assuming that most of our agencies have a policy procedure about the process of reporting that. But when it comes to state law, this is what it says. The reports required by, and then it has a list of the numbers there, and by any other sections of this chapter shall be made orally and immediately by telephone or otherwise to the state attorneys of the county in which the child resides or is present, to the Department of Social Services, or to the law enforcement officers. The mandatory reporter who witnessed a disclosure or evidence of abuse or neglect must be available to answer questions when the initial report is made pursuant to this section. The state's attorney or law enforcement officers, upon receiving this report, shall immediately notify the Department of Social Services. Any person receiving a report of suspected child abuse and neglect shall keep a report confidential as provided in these chapters. So just a little bit of, you know, what is the law when it comes to that? And I think that most of us are probably pretty familiar with that. And then the next section is maintaining appropriate boundaries. This addresses the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries in our prevention work. So we've all probably had experience in dealing with boundaries in our professional and personal lives. So for example, how many of us have ever talked to someone who came just a bit too close for comfort, invading our personal space? Has that ever happened? Yep. I just remember Dirty Dancing. This is your space. This is my space, kind of a thing. the movie Dirty Dancing. I was not Dirty Dancing. Just needed to clarify that. And then how many of you have ever said to someone that you work with or felt this way, I just don't feel comfortable doing what you're asking me to do? Has that ever happened? Yeah, you know, it's kind of out of my scope of work, right? So according to this principle, we must act respectfully and responsibly toward who we serve, their family members and other community members. Part of this acting respectively and responsibly is maintaining those appropriate boundaries. So I do have a poll here, I believe. I just got to find it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to launch it, and I would like you to read through these scenarios and tell me what you think, yes or no. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the polling, and I'm going to share results. So the first one, a prevention professional loans a member of her parenting skills group money to pay for a cell phone so she can communicate with other group members. All of us say no, this is not appropriate. So yeah, prevention professionals should not enter into personal financial arrangements such as loans with recipients or their family members. Next one is a prevention professional who also works with it as a math tutor markets his tutoring services to participants of his youth program and their parents. Is the prevention professional maintaining appropriate boundaries? So we have 88% said no and 13% said yes. The answer is actually no, and this is why. Prevention professionals should not promote products, services to service recipients or family members for personal gain. Similarly, they should not receive compensation for referring service recipients or family members to other professional services. And then the next one. A prevention professional asks an appreciative member of her mentoring program for help painting the house. Is this maintaining appropriate boundaries? 100% of us says no. So yeah, we should not accept favors or gifts from service recipients or their family members. And the next one, a prevention professional invites a well-spoken youth participant from her media advocacy group to speak at an upcoming task force meeting. Where am I here? 100% of the, or no, 88% of us said yes, 13% said no, that's not appropriate. And the answer is yes. As prevention professionals, we are encouraged to invite community members to share their insights and participate in the prevention process. And the last one, right? Yeah. A prevention professional begins dating a current participant in a high school peer leadership program. Is this professional maintaining appropriate boundaries? 100% of us said no. Yep, we must keep our relationships with service recipients professional and never cross that line because we don't want to exploit that relationship, right? All right, good job. Let me get rid of that. All right, so we finished up kind of this the principles of the nature of services. And so we would just want to make sure that we involve members of that focus population and the broader community throughout the entire prevention process. We want to make sure we're protecting our participants from harm. And we also want to make sure that we are maintaining those appropriate boundaries. So thinking about that, do you have any questions? So what I'd like you to do while we transfer over to Michelle for the next section, I want you to pull out that ethics and prevention action steps. I want you to write down under nature of services, what is something that you learned or relearned, and one action you plan to take as a result of this principle. Does anyone want to share something they learned or relearned or an action that they plan to take?
One thing that I liked was from the beginning when you were talking about involving the focus population, and it was just a good reminder for me the importance of that. Like for me in middle school, to look at the broader community in that school, like, you know, in parents or teachers or paras or whoever it is, to include them. That yes, it's about, yes, what I do is about kids and I work with kids, but it just seems like the focus population could be bigger than what I think it is. That makes sense?
Absolutely. Yes. Because they can also then help to reinforce any messages that you are sending to educating about, right? Mm-hmm. Thank you. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle.
So we are going to start talking about Principle 5, confidentiality. We'll probably have to wrap it up on next Tuesday. I made a note to myself that next time we do this, we should probably do like a 2.5 hours so we can offer a couple of breaks. We had scheduled them in, but it's just a lot of information in 6 hours. And so
I honestly don't know how they say that this can be a 6-hour course, because I feel like we're going through it as quick as we can. So
yes. So I kind of think we'll have to do like 2.5 hours each session just to put in some breaks. But we will get you out of here by 11:30 today. And we're just going to have to just push it on through next Tuesday so we can get through everything. So Dodie, if you go to the next slide, and I would ask for a couple volunteers, just like Dodie did when we had kind of a scenario prior to. Would one person be willing to be Susan, the program coordinator, and the other one, Juanita, the nurse? And I guess I'll set this up. Juanita and Susan work in a community service agency. Juanita is a nurse working in the agency's health program, and Susan runs a youth substance use prevention program in another section of the agency. So who would be Susan? Who would be Juanita?
I'll be Susan.
I'll be Juanita.
Thank you.
So, what have you been up to?
I've been busy doing physicals with the youth at the middle school.
I'm actually running a program right now with a group of middle school students who have been caught experimenting with alcohol and other drugs.
I know. I saw Ethan today, who I think is in your program, and I'm concerned about him. Is he using drugs? He seems like such a nice kid.
How do you think Susan should respond to Juanita?
I can't talk about that.
Okay. Have you ever been in that similar situation, feeling uncertain about how much you should say or how much you can say about a participant? Yeah, often. Yep, absolutely. So we're going to revisit this later, just like we did with the other one when we're done talking about the confidentiality piece and see what Susan has to say there. If you would take out the prevention think tank, we're going to go to number 5 for confidentiality. This one's a little bit shorter. I'll go ahead and read it and just again make that mental note of anything that sticks out. Confidential information acquired during service delivery shall be safeguarded from disclosure, including but not limited to verbal disclosure, unsecured maintenance of records, or recording of an activity or presentation without appropriate releases. Prevention professionals are responsible for knowing and adhering to the state and federal confidentiality regulations relevant to their prevention specialty. Pretty straightforward. Anything you'd want to say to that? So here are the key concepts that we're going to talk about in regards to confidentiality. Complying with confidentiality laws and regulations, protecting confidential information from disclosure, and then releasing confidential information. When it comes to confidentiality, this usually means protecting participants' information. People are more likely to seek and benefit from services if they know their information is confidential. But we do know that sharing information about a participant sometimes is going to help them too. But you know, it's why we have HIPAA laws and stuff, because we want to know if we're going to seek services from somebody that's going to be kept confidential, you know, and I'm only going to tell the people that I want to know about that. And so it can make people's jobs a little bit more difficult when we have all the confidentiality laws, because you know that if you could talk to the other people working with that person, it would be easier, but it also is good that we have it to protect those people as well. Dodie, if you could go to the next slide, but then could you stop sharing for a second so I can share a document that thank you. Okay. So there are federal laws and regulations that relate to confidentiality and have implications for substance use prevention. So this includes the FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which states that a parent has the right to review records maintained by his or her child's school. HIPAA is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which protects the privacy of any information in an individual's medical record. And I know in our state, once your child turns 12, you actually have to have them sign a proxy saying that you can review the medical records. I wanted to review Dylan's medical records. I have him on a portal and he's 14, and I had to have him sign a proxy and send it in so I can review his medical, and after 12. So my 6th graders were turned 12 in September, and I'll have to have them sign a proxy so I can see their medical records. So HIPAA is very, very strong in our state. 42 CFR Part 2, also known as the Substance Abuse Confidentiality Regulations, which protects the confidentiality of substance abuse treatment and prevention records. Any questions about those? So you can, you know, if you have more questions about 42 CFR Part 2. I know if any of you are treatment counselors, you're probably pretty familiar with it, but we do abide by those as prevention specialists too. But you can, I printed it off and I can sure share it with you guys, or you can get that information from the internet as well. All right, go ahead, Dodie. Oh, sorry, I have to stop sharing. I would also say go back to your agency policy. I printed off mine, like we have a confidentiality policy. And so that's always something to look back as well. So you have federal laws, state laws, and then also your agency policy. And it is important to know when laws and regulations are inconsistent, the stricter law always applies. So your agency might not have as strict guidelines as the state laws, but you always have to go by the strictest law that there is out there, whatever that one might be. So federal law 42 CFR Part 2, this is the most rigorous federal and confidential law for substance abuse preventionals, and it is for both treatment and prevention. Go ahead, Dodi. So who must comply? Usually we'd kind of have you brainstorm this, but for sake of time, we'll talk about these. You can kind of read through those. So who must comply? Anyone and everyone with access to confidential information, either written or verbal, must comply with 42 CFR Part 2. So this includes part and full-time employees, prevention staff, the clinical staff, volunteers, administration, so those that might be taking payments or making appointments with them, student interns, contracted service providers, and then former staff members. Failure to comply with these confidentiality laws, regulations, and policies may damage relationship with program participants and result in loss of certification of program funds, fines, and possible litigations. Go ahead, Dodi. I will say, you know, when I do like a diversion class with students, I mean, I even say to them, like, you know, I want to honor your confidentiality. So if I see you out in public, I'm not going to acknowledge you unless you say something to me, you know, because I don't want people to ask, well, how do you know that person? You know, so just really trying to be mindful at all times of honoring that confidentiality when you're out in public as well.
Holy cow, was that hard?
Yes.
When you live and work in your community and you work with children and your kids go to school with some of the kids that you've had to interview or work with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. You're at a basketball game and, oh, there you go. There's that person, right? Or I've walked into several like restaurants where, you know, oh, one of them's working, or, you know, so yeah.
It's even more hard when the kids are the ones who come up to you.
Yes.
And they're like, hey.
Right.
Like, hi.
Right. But at that point, they're the ones coming to you, right? So I always say, if you want to come say hi to me, but I'm not going to, don't think I'm trying to be rude or that I don't recognize you. I'm just trying to honor your confidentiality.
But what's going to be hard is then if your kids say to you, well, how do you know that person?
Yep.
You know,
I always said, I just know them from PTA, or I know them from around. I know their mama.
Yep. So the guidelines for 42 CFR Part 2 is defining confidential information and disclosure, protecting confidential information, and then releasing confidential information to others. So information about individuals' substance use behavior. So if a youth participant in a prevention program tells her program leader that she's misusing prescription drugs, this information is confidential. However, it would remain the responsibility of the program leader to refer the participant to the appropriate services and assessment. Remember the integrity principle that we are ethically obligated to be supportive of assistance or treatment when either colleagues or service recipients show evidence of impairment. So we're not going to obviously tell other people about that this youth participant in your prevention program tells you they're misusing prescription drugs, but ethically, under integrity, we're going to get them referred on to the appropriate services. Does that make sense? The second one, there's information that identifies an individual as a participant in a program for substance users. So for example, a roster that lists the names of participants in a prevention program for youth who have experience with marijuana is confidential. So if you're doing, oftentimes if you're doing a universal prevention program, like you're doing it to all 7th graders in that school, that's not so much confidential information that you need to, because it's just to everybody, right? But if you were doing a selective or indicated program, such as a diversion Prime for Life program, those, you have them fill out a sign-in sheet. That information needs to be confidential. So this may also extend to programs for participants identified as at risk or engaging in risky behaviors. So maybe you're doing, I know with Project Success, sometimes you do some groups, children of alcoholics, something like that. That information would need to be kept confidential. Any questions about that? Okay, go ahead, Dodie. Defining disclosure. The act of revealing information to others that they don't already know. So disclosures, this can happen in many different ways, in writing or during conversation, and both intentionally and unintentionally. So we have a little poll here again. Is it disclosure of confidential information? So if you would go ahead and fill out yes or no to these, then we will talk through them. Okay, I think I can actually do it. End polling. Oh, share results. Oh, no, you did. Okay, so the first one, a prevention professional accidentally leaves notes on her desk about a program participant's experimentation with marijuana that a colleague ends up reading. Is this disclosure of confidential information? The answer is actually yes. Any communication of confidential information, whether verbal, in writing, or via email, is considered disclosure, even if it's unintentional. I have to tell you, I had to be more mindful of this. I have like a big calendar that sits on my desk that I write stuff on. And, I'll have someone call and leave me a message about diversion. I'll write their name, their telephone number down. And even that, I felt like, people could come. Now I have my own office, but when we were all in one in the Prevention Resource Center, and like people could come up from my desk for any reason and see that person's name and their number written there, and that would be disclosure of confidential information. So it can happen easily unintentionally, right? A prevention professional shared the percentage of program participants who tried marijuana in the last month with a local researcher who studies substance use. Is this disclosure of confidential information? The answer to this one is actually no, because we're not sharing who used, right? So sharing information, even about substance use behavior, is not considered disclosure of confidential information if it is not done, by using people's names. So it's just as a whole, we're just saying a percentage. I'm not saying, Michelle and Dodie use marijuana. I'm saying, 20% of high school students reported using marijuana in the last month. So extra care should be taken, however, when sharing information about participants in small groups, since it may be easy to identify an individual group member unintentionally. So if you only had like a group of 5 people and you said 2 of the 5 were using marijuana, that gets a little dicey because you're getting down to some really small numbers. It's why in our state, sometimes we can't really hone into county level data even, because sometimes it's too the information, you know, the data is too small that you could be able to start pinpointing people. And so we have a hard time really getting down to that county and level, or for sure town level, because we'd be able to identify people. That third scenario is a prevention professional shares with a concerned counselor the family contact information from the file of a participant in a program for early substance users. And you all said yes, and you're correct. The communication of any information from the record of a participant who's been identified as a substance user is considered disclosure. Fourth one here is a prevention professional shares with the middle school secretary a participant list for life skills programming serving all 7th and 8th grade classes to confirm that it is up to date. Is this disclosure of confidential information? And it's not. Because since the program serves all 7th and 8th grade students, participation in it does not indicate anything about the participants' use and behavior. So therefore, sharing the roster is not considered disclosure. Do you have any questions about those? Does that make sense? Okay, Dodie. Just a couple more slides. Well, I don't know. Is this a good stopping point? We got through that first section. I think we'll go ahead and stop here and see if we have any questions of anything we've covered thus far. Okay, so when we meet again, is it next Tuesday?
Yes.
We will finish up with Principle 5 confidentiality, and then we will go through Principle 6 and then ethical decision-making process. So hopefully you guys can be a little bit more engaged in the process versus listening to us talk. That would be the other thing. We'd like to break out into groups more and to break out rooms, but just a lot of information in a short amount of time. So with that, hope you guys have a wonderful weekend, and we will see you next Tuesday morning.
Have a good weekend, everyone.
Have a good weekend.
You too.